I am going to hand things over to Tempest and Ife with this first question. What are the benefits of incorporating cross-content visual arts?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming today. I'm really excited to see the range of backgrounds and experiences that everybody had. So first I wanted to just start, and I did see that a lot of you guys were art teachers, so you may already know a lot of this information, but hopefully you can add some of your thoughts in the chat and add some value that way. But so the benefits of cross-content visual arts, there have been tons of studies that have shown that arts-rich environments can actually increase academic scores. And what I did was I pulled an example of turnaround arts. They're certainly not the only example, but they're very well documented. And we do have a list to this study in our resource that I would encourage you to go and check later on. But basically what they do is they work with schools across the country. They work with, I believe, 60 schools at the moment. And these are all schools that have been deemed low performing. And they take them and they infuse them with art experiences. They train the classroom teachers to integrate art into their classroom. They add art specialists and they set up partnerships with art organizations throughout that community. There was an evaluation that they did with 8 of the schools that they had taken on. And after the 2-year evaluation, they saw that 8 of the 8 schools had improved in either reading or math proficiency, and many of those schools in double digits. So pretty impressive and very well documented. I encourage you to go back and check out the full resource here. But the benefits of cross-content visual art, we bulleted some of them out. And so the first is that integrating visual arts can provide students with a deepened understanding of diverse perspectives, with opportunities to share their personal experiences, opinions, and ideas, with an invitation for students to deeply and critically engage with and build on each other's ideas. Integrating visual arts into core subjects can provide teachers with insight into student problem-solving processes by making student thinking visible, with the ability to engage learners in multifaceted capacities, which effectively address diverse learning styles and incorporate student choice, with a tool to hone and apply analytical and critical thinking skills, and with the ability to assess student understanding by offering opportunities to authentically problem solve. So it offers quite a bit. So what we did was we pulled this art project where students created an Olympic torch. And I just wanted you to think about some of those things that I just bulleted out, and they're over on the side here on the left-hand side, and think about which ones you could apply to this project. And if you see one that does apply, you can go ahead and stick it in the chat and I'll read through them right now. So A is a deepened understanding of diverse perspectives. B is opportunities to share their personal experiences, opinions, and ideas. C, to deeply and critically engage with and build on each other's ideas. D, insight into student problem-solving processes by making student thinking visible. E, ability to engage learners in multifaceted capacities, which effectively address diverse learning styles and incorporate student choice. F, hone and apply analytical and critical thinking skills. Or G, assess student understanding by offering opportunities to authentically problem solve. So just take a second and think if any of those apply to this project and stick it in the chat. Yeah, so I'm not seeing the chat right now because I don't have it open on my computer, but none of them really can fit that project very well. And I wanted you to reflect on this just to illustrate a point. And that's when we say visual art education, it's a very broad term. And when we say visual art education and refer to its benefits, we're referring to a visual art education that is of a certain quality, because curriculum does matter in this case. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through a Doodles Academy project so that you can understand how we approach visual art education and also get a visual and understanding of how you might approach visual art education in your classroom with the specific goal of tapping into those benefits that I listed previously. Okay, so these are all samples from the Doodles Academy publication Outside the Lines, specifically issue 4 of that, which is called The Introspective Artist. And you'll be receiving a free copy of this issue so that you can look more closely at any of the points that I make, but both Ife and I work very closely on this publication. But for all of our projects, we start with a learning outcome rather than a finished art project. And what this means is that we're using art as specifically as a tool for learning, as opposed to choosing a project for its artistic skill building capacities. And in this case, we want to focus on the concept of identity. So we started by having students do exercises that helped them increase awareness of this key topic. So the page shown has students in conversation with each other, asking each other, who are you? And building a repository of information about themselves and also about their peers. And this is a pretty common approach for us, having a section where students are building knowledge around the topic. This is the raw material that they will pull on and use when tasked to make an art piece. And really, you can connect this pretty easily to any of the topics that you're studying in class. Ife, did you want to add anything to that?
Well, I noticed in the chat that some of the teachers mentioned they're working on perspective, they're working on point of view, and I think those topics really align well here when we're thinking about identity. You know, I think this is a great opportunity for our ELA teachers to be thinking about how you can use an activity like this in your class. If you're working around a theme like identity, point of view, or even like coming of age, right? All of these are sort of topics that are dealing with students reflecting upon themselves and representing it through their work. So I think those connect really well here.
So then we always add some perspective by having students look at and discuss artworks that help to show different ways that artists have approached and explored the topic. In this case, these artists both explore identity in their works, but in very, very different ways. So the works we choose tend to show different techniques as well as different conceptual ways to approach the topic. And the reason that this is important is really to place students in a position where they know that they will be expected to approach the project uniquely, so that they're not just replicating a sample that their teacher has made. And just a note that you can see, just for time's sake, I'm not going to go over it in detail, but you can see at the bottom how each of these approaches is capturing some of those bullets that we had listed before. So finally, we get to the art project, only after they've built up this repository of knowledge and then also looked at a lot of different examples and a lot of different viewpoints. And at this point, we're asking students to reflect on the knowledge that they've been given and the discussions that they have had and apply that knowledge in a way that is personally significant to them. And this has so many important benefits, not least that it engages students because it allows them to tell their own stories. And it also allows teachers to authentically assess if students are understanding and processing the information that they've given them in the classroom. Students are not giving a correct answer, rather they're sharing their thought processes, which is incredibly valuable. For this particular project, we asked students to collect found materials that were significant to them, which could be anything from letters to text to photos. And then we walked them through how to create a Who Am I collage. So you can see that this particular assignment pulls on the activities and discussions that they had previously had. So that was kind of the end of that key idea, but I did want to, before moving on, really quickly share this project. The portion that I just showed you is actually one of 4 segments within each of these series. And the series is, each series is based around an essential question, and then each segment focuses on a slightly different idea that is related to that question. And so for the final segment, student looks at examples of where firsthand accounts were important towards our understanding of a personal moment a specific moment in history. So we looked at Anne Frank and Frederick Douglass. And then they went and created a collective sketchbook or a visual journal with their class. And within the sketchbook, students used all the skills that they had accessed during previous lessons to create a page sharing their experience of COVID and the COVID pandemic. So they shared their own personal experience, but they also, because it was a collective sketchbook, could see how their peers had different experiences of the same time period, different but often similar. Ife, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I would just chime in that this provides an opportunity for us to really think about cross-content collaboration. So I know we have some art teachers in the room. Someone mentioned that they're working on color theory. I think this is a great opportunity for us to think about how our ELA teachers could be collaborating with our social studies, our history teachers, and our art teachers could work there as well. So if you're working around color theory, if you're working around principles of design, and students are learning those in the class, they're actually incorporating those themes into projects that they're working on for their other class. I think there's also an opportunity if we're talking about ELA and social studies or ELA and history, collaborating, thinking about like Anne Frank and World War II units, right? And creating sort of visual works that respond to those, or Little Women and women's suffrages. These are just sort of some topical examples, but there's lots of opportunities for us to think about how our units and our topics connect across classes, and how we can be creating sort of works that deepen student learning and content topics.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. I think, we should always view this as not necessarily happening in one classroom or one environment. These are often opportunities for us to connect to teachers in our school. Should we just answer this question? I wasn't sure if we were following sorry for the
I'm so sorry. You are right. So we're moving to question 2. I was just writing in my reactions, actually. So I'll say it out loud. I was thinking about the student experience that way, Tempest, when they're learning with their different teachers about that same content and can make those meaningful connections in different ways. That's just such a rich student experience as well. So then to our next question, how can teachers who don't consider themselves artists, and that might be several of us on the line, how can we effectively lead arts integration in our lessons if art is kind of an area that we are not used to exploring ourselves?
Yeah, so ultimately, I think in these cases, we're thinking less about artistic skill, right? And a specific sort of practice that you are trying to get across. And you're really focusing on the outcome and the goal as it relates to the content and what we want our students to be able to do. And so we're sort of outlining it in this structure of plan, teach, guide, and really digging into this idea of considering the quality of the invitation, right? Thinking about sort of projects or plans that are really going to deeply engage students, that are going to give them a blueprint to follow, or excuse me, not give them a blueprint to follow. So not sort of create like a specific model of what it is that they should be doing, but giving them examples that'll really inspire them. And so we want to be thinking about this invitation as an opportunity for students to express themselves as individuals. So Tempest just gave this example of these mixed media collages, thinking about sort of the range of references, artistic references that we can give students that really show diversity of ultimate product, but really hone them into the idea, the core idea that we want them to be exploring. I love this last point where we're saying, like, if you know what your students' work is going to look like, then that's really not sort of a broad enough invitation, because we want students to be able to explore. We want them to be able to dig into their own creativity, and we want them to really be sort of aligning with the content ideas, but taking that in a personal way where they are able to represent their own thinking as they're working. We don't want students to copy a sample. We want every student's work to really be sort of indicative of who they are and what they're thinking and how they're making meaning of the content.
And great. So then when you go into teaching, just really emphasizing multiple perspectives whenever you can. So just for example, using many examples of artists who have drawn from a similar topic or theme, but in dramatically different ways. And we do have a resource there where linked to the diverse artist list in the resources, which is a good starting point. If you do need to show an example of a final product, which you don't always have to, so don't assume that you do, but if you do, try and show more than one. And this moves students away from viewing the project as having a right or a correct answer. And then also when inviting students to make an artwork, really focus on that ideation stage. So ask students how they personally would approach the creative problem, and try and highlight more than one answer whenever possible.
And in terms of guidance and what guidance looks like if you are not an art educator, really focus on the process. Focus on the goal, again, of what we are prompting students to explore and understand. And really, I think, celebrating sort of the exploration and the practice part that students are doing. And I'm just looking at some of the comments that are coming up. I think, Terry, this idea of being vulnerable is huge, right? Like, not only us as educators, particularly if you're someone who's feeling like I'm not an artist, being vulnerable in that sense, but also encouraging your students to be vulnerable in their process as they are working with new materials and exploring their own sort of artistic practice. So, ultimately the goal is really that we are cultivating this development of ideas, right? We're cultivating this student exploration, we're championing that, we're supporting that, and we're focusing on that. And that's something that I think is really helpful, is also using sort of clarity of guidelines. So thinking about rubrics, we have some examples that we've shared with you guys in our resources, particularly when you're working with like older grades. These are really helpful in terms of outlining the guidelines of what we're looking for in terms of the thinking, right? So again, what is it that we want students to be doing? What is it that we want them to be understanding, and creating those guidelines with some clarity. So yeah, we really encourage that you sort of think about this as you're guiding students through this practice.
So our third question, I would transition for you all, is really thinking about strategies now. What strategies can content teachers use to implement supportive, effective art integration into their lessons?
Yeah, so now we're sort of like rolling into giving you some actual examples of actual activities that you can do. So we're going to be talking about two specific examples. We'll start out by talking about visual journaling. Tempest will guide us through some discussion of how we can incorporate visual journals into our content areas, what this process can look like, how they're beneficial for having students reflect and show their thinking. And then we're also going to talk about art observation and discussion. And this is really something that can be used with any content area. So I will be talking us through some modeling of the process of looking at artworks, how we can really structure student analytical discussion around looking at artworks. And we'll have a little bit of time for us to go into some breakout rooms and practice that together.
Great, so I'll start with the visual journaling. So just starting with a definition of what is visual journaling. Pretty simply, a visual journal is just what it sounds like. It's like a traditional journal, but instead of written entries, it can contain written entries, but it can also contain drawings, sketches, hand lettering, doodles, or even clippings of magazines and photographs. It's just a collection of feelings, thoughts, and ideas in visual form. It's very intentionally open-ended, and it allows students to work in ways that are most comfortable to them. So the benefits of visual journaling are that it's really easy to implement, and allows for information to be processed in a way that's culturally and personally relevant to students. It gives insight into how students are processing topics and information. And in addition, drawing has been proven to help students retain information, and studies have also indicated that formulating thoughts and experiences into a cohesive narrative helps with retention. So how to visual journal with your students. As we talked about before, the number one thing to keep in mind is quality of the invitation. The invitation should be open-ended. It should be a question or prompt that is thematically aligned to the academic subject, but keep in mind, this is not an illustration. You want to offer students opportunities to reflect and to take this topic and approach it in a way that is interesting to them. So I just gave you a couple of examples over here from that same outside the lines issue for with identity. And I'm only going to read through the first one just for time's sake, but just so that you get an idea of what we're talking about here. The first one is introduce yourself to someone who you have never met, who knows nothing about you. And then it gives a couple of different options for students who need some help starting. They can draw it, so they can describe themselves through pictures or symbols. For example, if you love books, draw a book, write it, write a letter to this person, introducing yourself and telling them about your likes, dislikes, culture, and community, or combine it, create a puzzle where you draw and label the different pieces that make you, you. So how to start? Super easy. Like I said, you just offer them a journal. And this doesn't have to be something that you buy from the store, although it can be, and that can make it special too, but it can be just as simple as a ream of paper folded and stapled. You can give students some time to decorate the cover and make it personal that way. But it really doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to take a lot of money or time. And then offer a variety of supplies such as pencils, pens, and markers. You do want to offer more than one, but it doesn't have to be special supplies. As you get really into visual journaling, there are a lot of supplies that you can branch into. And we, in our resource list, we have the Journal Junkies linked to, and that's a really, really good book if you want ideas for how to extend some of this visual journaling, but really start simple, get comfortable with it. Establish a regular time for journaling. This can be whatever's on your schedule. It can be once a day, it can be once a week, but just do something and stick to it. And then establish a routine just like you would with anything else. For example, quiet music and private spaces are the ideas that we have, but it's really whatever works for your classroom. You just want to be consistent about how you approach these ideas and this time for the students. And then the last one that I put down is set expectations around privacy. And this is going to differ from class to class. Typically what I do when I visual journal with students is I tell them that they don't have to share anything with me that they do not want to. So that they feel comfortable working pretty openly in their journals. And then they also often will choose to share. I'll set up a self-assessment for students to do if I do need to make sure that they are processing these ideas. But I do also allow time and space for them to optionally share because I think that's a really important part of this. I don't make them if they don't want to. But if your classroom differs, just make sure you let them know so that they know if what they are doing is going to be private or not. Okay, so I'm going to pass it over to Ife.
Yes, so in talking about discussion, art discussion and art observations, we're really talking about the process of intentionally and in a structured way guiding students through the process of observing artworks and thinking analytically and critically about the works that they're observing in a way that allows them to interpret the meaning and describe, have discussions, have meaningful discussions about the meaning of the artwork in a group. These really help to develop students' public speaking skills, critical thinking, analytical skills, which we see connected to content area learning standards. It also provides opportunities for students to deepen their understanding, right? By making connections not only to the content, but to various perspectives or diverse experiences that relate to the content that they're learning about. And then, of course, they help to build visual literacy as well. And so, I mentioned some of those standards. So we're thinking, specifically, we know that there are connections to Common Core speaking and listening standards. Specifically with Common Core speaking and listening standards, we know that all of the grades have a standard that is prompted or centered around having students engage in collaborative discussions, right, with diverse partners around topics and issues. And so we see that this is something that is really honed in and practiced when we're looking at artworks and structuring discussion around artworks. Same thing with our next generation standards. With our next generation standards, there's 3 of them actually. Standards 1, Standards 2, and Standards 9, all are dealing with reading a text closely. So in this case, we're talking about reading an image closely to really understand explicitly, implicitly what is happening, to be able to make logical inferences, to be able to determine central ideas or themes that are that we're observing, and to be able to analyze and evaluate what we're observing, right? So we see that all of this is touched on and looped into when we are structuring art observation. I already mentioned how it increases the ability to understand a topic, and we're actually going to look at some images from World War II that are really dealing with diverse perspectives, multiple sort of perspectives of folks who were involved in World War II as a way of illustrating that. And I'd love, as we're sort of working through this, for you guys just to be thinking about how you can imagine your students developing their critical thinking skills, developing their visual literacy as you would be guiding them through this practice. So I'm gonna model this for us. So I would love to have you all participate in the chat here with me. If you feel compelled to unmute yourself, I'd love to hear your voice as well. There's a small enough group of us that I think we can do this. So we're looking at this image by Toyo Miyatake. Toyo was a Japanese photographer who was actually incarcerated in the Manzanar incarceration camp. And he started out photographing in secret, and then ultimately actually got permission from the government to photograph. So I would love for you to just take 30 seconds to observe this image. Just notice all the details. Notice what is jumping out at you automatically. And then as you're observing, if you can start to put in the chat, what are some of the first things that you notice? What are some of the first details that really stand out to you about this image? So literally just telling me what you see. So we're noticing the perspective. I'm going to scroll up. The viewpoint that's being represented here, the mood that's being represented, the values of the gray tones, hands on the wire, absolutely. The young boys who are gazing outwards, noticing the watchtower behind them, the mountains that are even further in the background. Children's faces. I'm seeing a lot of the hands in the background. Someone's noticing the way that the boys are dressed. Okay. Longing for better days. Great. All right. So as you're continuing to put in what you see, and this is great, this chat is moving, so I'm just scrolling down and continuing to see what people are noticing. The repetition, northern light gazing outwards and past the barbed wire. Okay, so tell me what you think this means. Of the details that you just typed into the chat, what is the meaning? What is Toyo representing with those details and his representation of those details?
It seems like it's a desire to escape. Like they're willing to put their hands on that barbed wire, even though it's hurting, because they want to get out.
Yeah. So, and someone else in the chat said longing, right? So this longing of what's past the barbed wire, this desire to be able to move beyond it. A sacrifice, I think, Jennifer, I heard you talking about, right? Touching this sharp barbed wire because there's a desire to sort of move past it. Yeah. I see Carrie saying the children are being trapped, longing for the future outside of the wire and pressing against it. Someone said the meaning, the family had all the same dreams as others who are not in the camp. I want to come back to that, AGF, so that's great. We could leave if we want to, but the truth is we're a passive, agreeable community. Okay, so continue to put in despair. Continue to put in what you think it means. And then now I'd like you to add and tell me also, someone's noticing that some of the boys are leaning in, some of the boys are not leaning in. So it looks like the one in the center is really sort of leaning towards the wire. The one in the foreground is kind of just standing there, right? And then we see the boy in the background also standing there, maybe not leaning forward as much. So tell me, how do you know? Based on the meaning that you said, the meaning that you are observing, how do you know that that's what this image is meant to represent? What are the details that really make you know that's what the message is, or that's what the meaning is? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So she's just going to go back up to see. I think Kathy had a comment about being able to leave. If we wanted to, Kathy, do you want to unmute yourself and share with us again the meaning that you had?
I just thought it shows that they could leave. The wires are far apart. They're dressed very nicely. They're not afraid of the wire. They're reaching out and touching it. One boy is so unconcerned by the wire. Both hands are still in the pocket. They could easily leave, but they know they're supposed to stay, so they do.
Okay. So yeah, Kathy is observing that it seems like they could leave. It seems like there's ability to move beyond the wire. But there's something that is like stopping them from doing so.
Yeah,
Would you suggest, I mean, we're all clearly bringing our background knowledge to this image, but for students who might not have that background knowledge, is the recommendation that, I mean, and I could see doing it in both ways or even as a comparison, but like before a unit starts, and what do they notice, and then give them background information that they then apply to it, which may change their perspective of what they're envisioning or what how they're interpreting it. Because we bring so much of what we know to our interpretation. So, I could imagine doing it first and then going back like 2 weeks later and saying, now look at this image and what do you think about it?
That's exactly right. Yeah. So I would recommend, I mean, obviously there's different ways that you could incorporate it based on your intention, right? And where you are in your unit. But in this particular context, you can be thinking about it as an introduction to the content topic. And so first you're just having students make observations, right? And analyze the work and try to derive meaning and derive understanding from it. And then as you are going through the unit and you're actually giving them context and background, I think exactly like you said, Jennifer, right? There's the opportunity to bring additional works. There's the opportunity to circle back and revisit the works and have students revisit, has your perspective change? Has your perception change? How does your context now alter the way that you're reading the work? And I think, you have to be open to, when you're doing these observations, that the students' interpretations will change, right? Based on when they actually have context and understanding. And so one thing that we can do is we can just sort of prompt students to continue to think and prompt the discussion. And that is really sort of the meat of the activity at this point when it's early in the unit, is that you're getting the students, there may be differing or contrasting interpretations of the meaning of the work. And so you're cultivating the discussion, and then you can circle back to specific details and historical context once you introduce it into the class.
It'd be interesting because we're all assuming, or knowing our background knowledge, that they want to get out, but it could be people looking in to others. Maybe they're the ones that aren't in the wire and the others are, that they're kind of looking. Like I think about the boy in the straight pajamas and the kids on the other side of that fence.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I'm just looking at the time, so I'm going to stop us here. What I would say is that, this is a very sort of short timeline, right, of practicing this observation. Obviously, we could do this for another 10, 15 minutes. I would also add in, how do you know, as another question. So we ended with, what does it mean? And I would also add in, how do you know, so that our students are giving us some sort of examples and evidence as to why they're deriving the meaning that they are. And just to your last point, you know, I think what's interesting when we're looking at Toyo's work is that we know all of the photographers who were shooting for the WPA at this time were not allowed to incorporate barbed wire. We're not allowed to incorporate watchtowers, right? We're meant to photograph these incarceration camps in ways that really kind of softened the perception or the representation of them for the general public to make it seem as if they were not so bad, not such bad places to be. And Toyo, with his sort of inside perspective, was able to photograph in a different way. And also, again, to your point, to come around the barbed wire, to come outside of it, or to have the boys actually go outside of it so that he could photograph them looking through. So the context here is very important. So if we can go to the next slide. Sorry, I was just plugging in my phone and or plugging in my computer, and my chair left me. Okay, so I have just the guidelines for the discretion that you guys can use as you're practicing this. So there's different sort of prompts that we can use when we're guiding students through the discussion. And in the resources that we give you, one of the professional development, Mary, that hasn't happened to me very much frequently, but it's funny that it happens when I'm on screen. One of the professional development resources that we give you guys is something called VTS, Visual Thinking Strategies. So that's one thing that you can look into. But many of these prompts are just kind of these open-ended questions that are really meant to get students to dig very deep into what they're observing and to start to analyze the meaning behind the symbols, the images, the context of what they're looking at. So we're going to have you guys actually go into breakout rooms. We'll have you in breakout rooms where one of you will volunteer to be the facilitator, and you will get a document. I think that Carrie may have already put it into the chat that has these prompts. So just as I did, you can start by just having folks in silence or just for a couple of seconds actually observe the image without participating in discussion, and then starting to break down what it is they see, what it means, and how they know. And then have them start to make some connections. So, you know, how do you know that this is the meaning of the image? What does it remind you? And that's where I think you can start to get into that context that Jennifer was talking about in her question. So if we can have you, we should be opening up the breakout rooms in a moment. On the document that has been popped into the chat, you will see that there are several different images, and your group will be assigned an image just to sort of streamline the process. So just go to the image that you see your breakout room is connected to. And we're looking at all images that, like the Toyo Miyatake image, are connected to World War II and are representing different perspectives of folks who were involved or how they were involved in the war. I will say also, as you're heading into your breakout rooms, when you come back, we do have some resources that we will be sharing with you. So please don't pop out at the end of your breakout room. Please come back because we want to make sure that you guys all get the resources. And we will be back by 7:55. So you have about a little over 10 minutes to do the observation with each other in small groups.
Great, so we're going to open up breakout rooms right now. You can join and chat. Hopefully you all got a great chance to engage in some discussion.
Yeah, while I'm getting this up, Ife, do you want to like quickly just kind of do a recap of it? It sounded like maybe that was happening as I was.
Yes, and I know that we are flowing into just sort of outgoing notes, but I will say that as you're thinking about how that went, I know that folks were participating in my group in different ways. Cindy says that she wasn't able to be verbal, but she was still able to participate in the conversation. Sometimes silence and timidness can be really common. It's something that, students sometimes can be slow to participate. So that's something that you can expect, and just know that, the more that you're able to really hone in on what do you see immediately, which details jumped out, these sort of really low stakes questions can help students feel a little bit more comfortable engaging in the dialogue. I'll also say very, very quickly that all of the images that we were looking at here really gave us a different perspective. So we're looking at Gun Tub Tim. So these are African-American men who actually were below deck servicemen who came out and worked above ship, and were sort of experiencing segregation in the Navy at that time, were recognized for their valor, but didn't actually get the awards that were due to them until the 90s, so until several decades after their service. We're looking at a Japanese family who was on their way to the incarceration camp. We're looking at an image of Betty Giles, who's representing women who actually served as pilots during World War II, and then an image from Robert Capa actually showing like in the midst of an action. So really just giving students these different perspectives to help them focus in on and understand different experiences that were happening during the war. I know this is a very sort of quick wrap up because we are limited on time, but I think this is a great example of how you can use art observation and use images to really help deepen students' understanding of historical events, or really of different topics that you're incorporating into your classes.
Thank you. And I'm sorry if I was the one who awkwardly cut off the Zoom chat. If you had already started debriefing, I realized. So apologies on that transition. We wanted to make sure to get to some resources for all of you. So we will be sharing in the chat, we'll be sharing a link to the free copy of the issue that Ife and Tempest have been talking about, Introspective Artists. And then there's also a huge list of additional resources that we'll have on it. You'll get the presentation, you'll get the resource list as well. So you'll be able to see all of those. And the final thing that we're going to be putting in the chat is a, oh, I'm sorry, do you want to talk about the rubric, Tempest? I just want to make sure we get folks out in the next minute here.
Yeah, I'll just say very, very quickly, this is a sample template that you can use. Please go ahead and read through it. There's an example of an overview, so what the content is, and then an actual like project related sample there, and a space for you to use the prompts to create your own rubric. So if you're creating, and whether it's visual journaling or another activity, and you wanted to incorporate a rubric that really clearly outlined guidelines, here's a sample that you could use for your classes.
Thank you. So just a couple action items to close us out. If you could please complete our survey. We try to run these coffee and conversation events and learn from all of you about what's most helpful to you. So that is in the chat. You can follow us on social media to learn more about other events that we are hosting. And coming up at the end of this month, on the next slide, we have just a little information about a webinar that will be on March 29th. Those tickets will be available on Eventbrite as well. And this is a webinar called Learning from Mistakes, Easier Said Than Done. So hopefully you would be interested in potentially joining us for that. And again, all of the resources will be shared. They'll be posted on the website. So under webinars, coffee and conversation, and they'll also be shared with the email list where you signed up for tickets tonight. So you should get that either end of this week or early next week. Thank you all so much.